Steam rose from Judge Michael Richardson's artisanal coffee cup, creating swirling patterns in the early morning light that filtered through his chamber's tall windows. The aroma of fresh Brazilian roast mingled with the familiar scent of old leather-bound law books that lined the mahogany shelves of his office. At 65, he had developed an appreciation for these quiet moments before the day's proceedings began. His father's photograph watched over him from its pristine silver frame on the desk. Howard Richardson, also a judge, whose stern expression seemed to demand excellence even from beyond. Michael straightened his bow tie, a habit he'd maintained for 30 years on the bench, just as his father had done before him. The morning sun caught the silver threading in his own hair, reminding him of how time had passed since he first donned the black robes of justice. Taking another sip of coffee, he reviewed the day's docket with practiced efficiency. Parking tickets, minor infractions, routine cases that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection in the courthouse windows. His clerk, Jenny, had arranged the files in perfect chronological order, each manila folder bearing the weight of someone's story, though he'd long since stopped seeing them that way. "Your Honor." Jenny's voice accompanied her gentle knock. She stepped into the chambers, her sensible shoes silent against the plush carpet. "The morning docket is ready, and there's something else." She hesitated, adjusting her glasses in a way that suggested mild concern. "What is it, Jenny?" Michael asked, noting how she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a telltale sign of uncertainty he'd observed over their 15 years working together. "There's been a last-minute addition to the morning calendar. A parking violation. But the defendant—" She paused again, consulting her notepad. "She's elderly, sir. Requested special consideration for mobility issues." Michael suppressed a sigh. In his experience, everyone had a reason, an excuse, a special circumstance. The law applies equally to all, Jenny. You know that. "Yes, Your Honor." Jenny nodded, but her expression suggested she had more to say. "Is there something else?" "No, sir. There's something different about this one. I can't quite put my finger on it." Michael smiled indulgently at his clerk's perpetual soft-heartedness. "There usually is, isn't there? We'll handle it like any other case, fairly and efficiently." As Jenny withdrew, Michael stood to stretch his legs, walking to the window that overlooked the courthouse square. Below, the usual morning crowd gathered. Lawyers in press suits, clients in their Sunday best, tourists snapping photos of the classical architecture. A flash of silver hair caught his attention. An elderly woman slowly making her way up the courthouse steps, her posture remarkably straight despite her obvious age. Checking his watch, Michael noted it was time to begin. He adjusted his robes one final time, ran a hand over his precisely trimmed silver hair, and gathered the morning's files. The weight of his father's photograph seemed to follow him as he moved toward the door, its stern gaze a reminder of the Richardson legacy of unwavering justice. Little did he know that this ordinary autumn morning, with its routine coffee and familiar procedures, was about to become one of the most extraordinary days of his career. As he reached for his chamber door's brass handle, the grandfather clock in the corner struck 9. Its resonant chimes echoing through the room like a herald of change to come. The courtroom hushed as Judge Richardson took his seat, the leather of his chair creaking softly in the silence. Morning light streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. He adjusted his microphone with practiced precision, preparing to begin another routine session of traffic court. "Case number 247, Jenny announced, her voice clear and professional. "Sarah Thompson, parking violation on Cedar Street, September 15th. The elderly woman Michael had noticed earlier rose from her seat in the gallery. She moved with deliberate grace, her silver hair catching the sunlight like a crown. Her pearl necklace gleamed softly against her sky-blue dress, which, though clearly aged, was impeccably pressed. A small leather handbag hung from her arm, and in her hand, she clutched the parking ticket as if it were a delicate thing. As she approached the podium, Judge Richardson noticed something unusual in her bearing. Most defendants showed nervousness, defiance, or resignation. Sarah Thompson displayed none of these. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around her. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, her voice strong despite her years. The slight accent in her words caught his attention. Something European, perhaps French, softening the edges of her speech. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, glancing at the citation, "you're here regarding a parking violation on Cedar Street. How do you plead?" "I acknowledge that my car was there longer than permitted, Your Honor," she replied, placing her hands gently on the podium. "But I would like to explain the circumstances, if I may." Judge Richardson fought the urge to sigh. In his experience, explanations were usually excuses dressed in polite language. "Proceed, but please be brief." "I had parked to visit the children's library," Sarah began, her dark eyes holding a depth that somehow commanded attention. "I read to the young ones every Tuesday, you see. But that day, when I returned to my car, I found myself." She paused, choosing her words carefully, unable to leave immediately. The judge's pen tapped against his desk calendar. "Unable in what way, Mrs. Thompson?" "The space," she said softly, one hand unconsciously touching her pearl necklace. "It was very small, between two large vehicles. Sometimes, in small spaces, I need a moment to." Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, her composure wavered slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, while I sympathize, the law is clear about parking limitations," Judge Richardson stated, falling back on familiar phrases. "The fine is $150. A young man in the gallery shifted in his seat, leaning forward with sudden interest. David Martinez, the new clerk, was staring at Mrs. Thompson with growing recognition, his eyes widening as if seeing a ghost. "Your Honor," Sarah responded, her dignity undiminished, "I understand the law. I have always respected the law, even when." She touched her necklace again, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. "Even when the law did not always respect me." Something in her words, in the weight of history behind them, made Judge Richardson pause. Before he could respond, David Martinez stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice trembling with urgency. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to know about Mrs. Thompson." The courtroom fell silent, hanging in that moment between what was and what was about to be revealed. Sarah Thompson stood perfectly still, her eyes closed briefly as if preparing herself for what would come next, her fingers still resting on those luminous pearls that seemed to hold stories of their own. David Martinez stood trembling in the hushed courtroom, his legal papers forgotten on the bench beside him. The morning sunlight caught the brass buttons on his suit jacket as he stepped forward, his usual professional composure replaced by an urgent need to speak. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice steadier now. "I recognize Mrs. Thompson from my grandfather's memorial service last month at the Holocaust Remembrance Center." He glanced at Sarah, who remained perfectly still, her eyes now open and clear. She was there as a guest of honor. Judge Richardson's hand paused over his gavel. The courtroom, usually filled with shuffling papers and whispered conversations, fell into complete silence. Even the ancient radiator in the corner seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Martinez," the judge said carefully, "please approach the bench." He gestured for Sarah to stay where she was, noticing how she stood straight and tall, like someone accustomed to facing moments of significance with grace. As David approached, he pulled out his phone. "I have a photo, Your Honor, from the service. My grandfather and Mrs. Thompson were part of a documentary about survivors. She shared her story with us that day." He showed the judge a photograph of Sarah standing next to an elderly man, both of them holding candles at what was clearly a memorial service. Sarah's voice, clear and steady, carried through the courtroom. "It's all right, David. Some stories need to be told, even in unexpected places." She smiled gently at the young clerk, who looked both relieved and anxious. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Richardson said, his tone completely transformed from its earlier bureaucratic efficiency. "Would you be willing to share your story with this court?" She nodded, her hand once again finding the pearls at her neck. "These pearls," she began, "were given to me by Margot DuPont, the woman who saved my life. Each one represents a person who helped hide me during those dark years. A baker who brought extra bread, a neighbor who warned us of raids, a priest who forged papers." The judge noticed how the morning light through the windows seemed to soften, creating a gentle glow around Sarah as she spoke. Jenny, his clerk, had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keyboard. "I was sent to France in 1939, Your Honor, when I was just 9 years old. My parents in Mississippi thought I would be safer there, away from the troubles at home. They could not have known what was coming to Europe." She paused, gathering strength from some deep inner well. "The DuPont family took me in, and when the darkness came, they hid me along with their own children." David Martinez stepped back to his seat, but remained standing, as if sitting would somehow break the spell that had fallen over the courtroom. The morning schedule, with its neat rows of cases and citations, lay forgotten on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a teacher's gentle authority, "when I found myself in that small parking space yesterday, memories came back, not of anger or fear, but of hope, of how humanity can shine even in the darkest spaces." She touched the pearls one final time. "Sometimes, what looks like a simple story on paper holds chapters that can change how we see the world." Judge Richardson removed his reading glasses, suddenly aware that he was witnessing something far more significant than a routine traffic court session. The law book before him, with its clear rules and defined penalties, seemed inadequate for the moment at hand. The courtroom leaned forward as Sarah Thompson's voice transported them back through time. Even the ancient wall clock seemed to slow its ticking, as if pausing to listen to her story. "September 1939, she began, her eyes distant with memory. "I clutched my small suitcase on the deck of the SS Normandy. My mother had packed her recipe book inside, her gumbo recipe written in her beautiful handwriting, pages soft from years of use. 'Remember who you are,' she told me, 'but learn to be more.'" Judge Richardson found himself removing his reading glasses, folding them carefully as he listened. The morning sun painted shadows on his desk, like memories dancing across time. "The DuPonts lived in a blue-shuttered house in Paris," Sarah continued, her accent shifting slightly as she spoke of France. "Mama DuPont, Margot, taught French to foreign children. She had a garden where she grew lavender and roses. Every Friday, she would braid my hair and tell me stories while preparing for Shabbat." A tear rolled down Jenny's cheek at her clerk's desk, but she made no move to wipe it away. Sarah's voice painted pictures that filled the courtroom with colors of the past. "When the Germans came, everything changed. The blue shutters were closed more often than open. Papa DuPont stopped teaching at the university. But still, every Friday, Mama DuPont would braid my hair and whisper prayers. 'You are our daughter now,' she would say, 'and love knows no borders.'" Sarah's hand moved to her pearl necklace again, touching each bead as if reading a rosary of memories. "The DuPonts had 3 children of their own, Marie, Claude, and little Sophie. They never once treated me differently. When we had to hide, we all went together. The cellar became our world, our shelter from the storm above." The judge noticed how Sarah stood straighter as she spoke, as if the weight of her memories made her stronger rather than heavier. Her voice took on a teacher's cadence, sharing wisdom earned through extraordinary experience. "We played silent games in that cellar, Your Honor. Marie taught me to read French novels by candlelight. Claude showed me how to solve mathematics in my head. Sophie and I would write stories on imaginary paper with our fingers, stories about a future where we could all walk in the sun again." She paused, looking down at her hands, still elegant after all these years. "When the neighbors were taken, we could hear their footsteps above us. Mama DuPont would hold us all close, her arms somehow long enough to embrace 4 children at once. She would whisper, 'Remember, mes enfants, hate can destroy a house, but love can rebuild a world.'" The morning light through the courthouse windows had shifted, creating a warm glow around Sarah as she spoke. My dark skin, which had brought such challenges in Mississippi, became a blessing in France. The Germans looking for Jewish children never suspected me. I could sometimes go to the market for food, passing as just another child in the neighborhood. Sarah's eyes met Judge Richardson's directly now. You see, Your Honor, life has a way of turning what some see as burdens into gifts. The DuPonts taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about finding light in the darkness, about keeping your humanity when the world seems to be losing its own. The entire courtroom hung on her words. The routine morning transformed into a sacred space of remembrance and revelation. Judge Richardson's courtroom had never felt more like a classroom, with Sarah Thompson as its gentle teacher. The morning sun now streamed directly through the high windows, creating a warm spotlight where she stood. Her pearls caught the light, each one seeming to glow with the stories she carried. When I returned to America after the war, Sarah continued, her voice steady and clear, I brought more than memories. I brought Mama DuPont's lessons. She smiled softly, remembering. She gave me these pearls the day we parted, one by one, telling me the story of each person they represented. The judge leaned forward slightly, his usual stern expression softened by genuine interest. Would you share some of those stories with us, Mrs. Thompson? Sarah touched the first pearl at her throat. This one represents Henry, the baker. Every morning before dawn, he would hide extra loaves in the hollow of an old tree for the families in hiding. Her fingers moved to the next pearl. This is for Sister Marie Claire, who ran messages between safe houses, hiding them in her prayer book. Jenny had stopped typing entirely, her hands clasped together as she listened. Even the court officers stood perfectly still, captivated by the quiet power of Sarah's words. When I became a teacher here in Detroit, Sarah continued, I kept these stories alive in my classroom. Every pearl became a lesson about courage, about choosing kindness even when it costs you something. Her eyes met the judge's directly. My students learned that history isn't just dates and books. It's the choices people make every day. Judge Richardson found himself removing his reading glasses again, this time placing them carefully on his desk. How many students have you taught, Mrs. Thompson? A warm smile crossed her face. Over 40 years, thousands. And each one learned about Henry's bread and Sister Marie Claire's prayer book. They learned about the DuPont's blue shutters and the games we played in the cellar. She paused, touching another pearl. But most importantly, they learned what Mama DuPont taught me, that true justice comes from seeing the humanity in each person. The morning light shifted, creating a gentle rainbow where it passed through the courthouse's old glass windows. It fell across Sarah's shoulders like a shawl of colors. Your Honor, she said softly, yesterday when I found myself in that small parking space, it wasn't fear that filled me. It was remembrance. In that moment, I heard Mama DuPont's voice again, teaching me French poems in the cellar. I felt Marie's hand holding mine as we read by candlelight. Those memories don't trap me. They remind me of the strength we find in our darkest moments. The silence in the courtroom held a weight of understanding. David Martinez, still standing at his desk, wiped a tear from his cheek without embarrassment. Judge Richardson noticed how his own hands, usually steady with authority, trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. Each pearl, Sarah concluded, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room, is a testament to the light that shines in darkness, the kindness that blooms in danger, the humanity that persists even when the world seems to have forgotten it. She stood straighter, her dignity radiating like a quiet light. That's what I taught my students, Your Honor. That's what I'm still teaching today. A gentle stillness had settled over the courtroom, the kind that follows profound revelations. Judge Richardson finally broke the silence, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Mrs. Thompson, could you tell us more about yesterday? Sarah nodded, her hands folded calmly before her. I was at the Children's Library on Cedar Street, Your Honor. Every Tuesday I read stories to the young ones, stories about courage, about kindness, about understanding those who seem different from us. Through the courthouse windows, leaves danced on the autumn breeze, casting shifting shadows across the floor. Sarah watched them for a moment before continuing. After the reading session, a little girl asked me about my necklace. She noticed how I touch the pearls when I tell certain stories. Sarah smiled at the memory. I showed her how each pearl holds a different tale of bravery. Her eyes lit up with such wonder. Your Honor, children understand the power of stories better than anyone. Judge Richardson noticed how the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, drawn into her narrative. Even the court officers, usually stoic and detached, hung on every word. When I returned to my car, Sarah continued, I found myself wedged between two large vehicles. The space was so tight. Her voice remained steady, but her hand moved instinctively to her pearls. In such moments, some might panic. But Mama DuPont taught me something valuable in that cellar years ago. Jenny dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, trying to maintain her professional composure while typing. The gentle click of her keyboard provided a soft rhythm to Sarah's words. She taught me that when darkness closes in, we must become our own light. So there, in that small space between the cars, I did what we used to do in hiding. I began reciting the French poems she taught me. Sarah's voice took on a melodic quality as she spoke. Le temps à laser sun manteau de vent, de froideur et de pluie. The French words floated through the courtroom like music, transforming the municipal space into something almost sacred. Judge Richardson found himself holding his breath, the weight of his robes feeling somehow different on his shoulders. Time has left its mantle of wind, cold, and rain. Sarah translated softly. It's a poem about renewal, about hope returning after winter. We would whisper these words in the cellar, reminding ourselves that spring always follows winter. David Martinez had taken out his phone, recording her words with trembling hands. Mrs. Thompson shared this same poem at my grandfather's memorial, he said quietly. He used to say that poetry kept his soul alive during the darkest days. Sarah turned to him with a gentle smile. Your grandfather understood, dear. Sometimes our strongest shelter is built not of walls, but of words and memories. She faced the judge again. Yesterday, those poems were my shelter once more. I waited patiently, reciting verse after verse, until help arrived. Time passed differently in that space, wrapped in Mama DuPont's teachings. The sunlight had shifted now, falling directly across the judge's bench. In its warm glow, the parking citation seemed to fade into insignificance, a mere piece of paper against the weight of history and humanity that filled the room. Judge Michael Richardson sat motionless at his bench, the weight of the moment pressing upon him like his robes. The morning had transformed from a routine series of cases into something profound, something that would reshape his understanding of justice itself. He looked down at his father's ring on his right hand, the one he'd worn since taking the bench, a symbol of unwavering justice. But now, that very concept of justice seemed to be expanding before his eyes, becoming something deeper and more nuanced than the simple application of law. Mrs. Thompson, he began, his voice carrying an unusual tremor. I've sat on this bench for 30 years. Every day, I've looked at that photograph of my father in my chambers, trying to live up to his standard of blind justice. He paused, removing his reading glasses completely. But today you've taught me that true justice isn't blind. It sees with the heart as well as the eyes. Sarah stood quietly, her presence radiating a gentle strength that seemed to fill the courtroom. The morning light created a soft halo around her silver hair, and her pearls gleamed with the weight of history they carried. Your Honor, she responded with gentle wisdom. Your father's principles of justice are not diminished by adding compassion to them. They're enhanced by it. The judge nodded, a smile softening his usually stern features. The court wishes to offer more than just a dismissal of charges, Mrs. Thompson. I believe an apology is in order, not just for today, but for every time the system has failed to see the full humanity before it. Jenny's fingers hovered over her keyboard, tears falling freely now. David Martinez stood straighter, pride evident in his bearing, as he watched history unfold in the small courtroom. Furthermore, Judge Richardson continued, standing for the first time that morning, "I would like to request something, if you're willing." He stepped down from the bench, an unprecedented move that caused a ripple of whispers through the gallery. "Would you consider sharing your story with our judicial training program? Our new judges could learn valuable lessons about the true meaning of justice from your experiences." Sarah's eyes brightened with unexpected joy. "Your Honor, teaching has always been my calling. Whether in a classroom or a courtroom, the lesson remains the same. We must see each other's humanity first." The judge approached her, his formal demeanor giving way to genuine warmth. "You mentioned your students earlier, Mrs. Thompson. How many lives you've touched over 40 years of teaching. Today, you've added another student to that list." He gestured to himself with humility. "Sometimes the most important lessons come when we least expect them, and from the most unexpected teachers." The morning sun had reached its zenith outside, bathing the courtroom in golden light. The usual sounds of the courthouse, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, the click of typewriters, had given way to a profound silence, as if the very building was holding its breath in witness to this moment. "Case dismissed," Judge Richardson announced, but his tone carried more than just a legal verdict. It carried the weight of transformation, of understanding dawning like the morning sun outside. "And Mrs. Thompson, thank you for teaching an old judge that true justice wears many faces, and that wisdom often comes wrapped in the simplest of packages, even a parking ticket." 6 months later, the same courtroom buzzed with a different kind of energy. The morning sun streamed through freshly cleaned windows, illuminating rows of eager faces. Young law students, judicial trainees, and seasoned judges gathered for the inaugural session of Beyond the Bench. Lessons in Human Justice. Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, her pearl necklace catching the light just as it had that transformative morning. Judge Richardson sat nearby, not in his judicial robes, but in a simple suit, his posture that of a student rather than an authority. "Welcome," Sarah began, her warm voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Each of you wears, or will wear, the robes of justice. But today, we're here to discuss what lies beneath those robes, the heart that must beat in harmony with the law." The audience leaned forward, including Jenny, now promoted to program coordinator, and David Martinez, who had helped organize this initiative. On the walls hung black and white photographs. Henry the baker's hollow tree, Sister Marie Claire's prayer book, the DuPont's blue-shuttered house in Paris. "Justice," Sarah continued, touching her pearls, "is like this necklace. Each pearl represents a different facet of humanity. When we ignore any single one, the whole strand is weakened." She smiled at a young judicial trainee who was taking careful notes. "Your books will teach you the law, but your hearts must teach you how to apply it." Judge Richardson stood, joining her at the podium. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what justice meant," he shared, his voice humble. "Mrs. Thompson taught me that true justice requires us to look deeper than the surface of any case that comes before us." The program they had created together was already gaining attention across the state. Other courthouses had requested similar training sessions, recognizing the need to blend compassion with judiciary duty. "Remember," Sarah said, her teacher's voice gentle but firm, "every person who stands before you carries a story. Some stories are written in triumph, others in tears, but each one deserves to be heard." She held up a familiar piece of paper, the parking ticket that had started it all, now framed as a reminder. A student raised her hand. "Mrs. Thompson, how do we balance empathy with the need to uphold the law?" Sarah exchanged a knowing look with Judge Richardson before answering. "The law is our foundation, but humanity must be our guide. When I was hidden in that cellar years ago, the law of that time said I didn't deserve to live. But humanity, the humanity of the DuPonts, of Henry, of Sister Marie Claire, that humanity said otherwise." The morning light shifted, creating a rainbow prism through the courtroom's old windows. Judge Richardson watched as Sarah moved among the students, sharing her stories. touching lives as she had touched his. Her pearls gleamed with each movement, each one a testament to the power of human kindness. This courtroom, she concluded, gesturing to the space around them, is more than a place of judgment. It is a sanctuary of understanding, a place where justice and compassion dance together. She touched her final pearl, smiling. Mama DuPont used to say, "When we save one life, we save an entire world of possibilities." Today in this room, we're saving possibilities with every story we hear, every heart we open, every judgment we temper with understanding. The legacy of that unexpected morning continued to ripple outward, touching life after life, case after case, proving that sometimes the greatest changes begin with the smallest moments, even a simple parking ticket on an autumn day.